Sometimes life breaks us in ways that seem unforgivable. Sometimes the people we trust most leave us when we need them most. Svala learned both truths on her wedding day in ancient Nordheim. Once the finest dancer in her village, illness had taken her ability to walk. Her betrothed took one look at her, seated in that carved wooden chair, and simply vanished. The wedding guests whispered and stared while she sat alone beneath the sacred tree. Then heavy footsteps approached. Jarn the Mountain, a warrior of legend, walked through the crowd, 7 feet tall and feared by enemies across the northlands. He knelt before her chair and spoke words that would change everything. "You are not less," he said. "You are more because you endure." Then he asked if she would marry him instead. But would a woman broken by betrayal find the courage to trust again? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silver bells had fallen silent 3 seasons ago, but Svala could still hear their music in her dreams. She would wake each morning to the phantom sound of metal singing against metal, the gentle chime that once announced her presence in the great halls of Nordheim. Those bells had been her pride, crafted by the finest smiths, each one tuned to a different note, creating melodies that seemed to flow like water as she moved. Svala's fingers traced the familiar engravings on the bells, where they now rested in their wooden box beside her bed. Each curve and line told a story of celebration, of nights when the entire village would gather to watch her dance. She had been poetry in motion then, her feet barely touching the ground as she spun and leaped, the bells creating symphonies that made even the stoniest hearts weep with joy. The fever took more than just your legs, didn't it? Her mother, Astrid, had said one morning as she watched Svala stare at the silent bells. "It took your song." The words had stung because they carried truth. Before the illness struck during the harshest winter in living memory, Svala had been the voice of celebration for their people. Weddings, harvest festivals, victories in battle, none felt complete without her graceful movements transforming ceremony into magic. Children would beg their parents to stay late just to watch her dance one more time. Young warriors would claim her performances gave them courage before battle. Even the village elders, normally stern and practical, would find themselves smiling as she wove stories through movement. Eriksson had fallen in love with that version of her. The merchant's son had courted her for 2 full seasons, bringing gifts from distant lands, silk scarves that flowed like water, exotic spices that made her mother's cooking legendary, and once a mirror of polished bronze so clear it seemed magical. He had been handsome in the way that made other girls jealous, with golden hair that caught sunlight and eyes blue as fjord water. "I dream of watching you dance at our wedding," he had told her beneath the old oak where lovers had pledged their hearts for generations. "I dream of our children inheriting your grace." She had believed him. Why wouldn't she? Their families approved the match. His father's trading connections would bring prosperity to her clan, while her status as the village's treasured dancer would elevate his standing among the people. It seemed a perfect joining of practical advantage and genuine affection. Then came the fever. It started as a simple chill during the coldest stretch of winter, when even the seasoned hunters struggled to find game. The village healer tried every remedy she knew: bitter teas, heated stones, prayers to the old gods. For 7 days, Svala burned with fever so intense that her family feared she would not survive. Her mother never left her side, bathing her with cool water and whispering ancient songs meant to call wandering spirits back to their bodies. On the 8th day, the fever broke. Svala opened her eyes to find her worried family surrounding her bed, relief flooding their faces. She tried to sit up, tried to swing her legs over the side of the bed, as she had done countless times before. Nothing happened. The legs that had carried her through intricate dances, that had leaped and spun with supernatural grace, lay still as fallen branches. She could see them, could even feel a strange tingling sensation, but they would not obey her commands. The healer spoke of damaged spirits, of invisible wounds that sometimes lingered after great fevers. Others whispered of curses, though none dared speak such thoughts aloud. Eriksson had visited twice during her recovery. The first time, he brought flowers and spoke hopefully of her return to health. The second time, he stood awkwardly by her bedside while she demonstrated that her legs, though they looked unmarked, would no longer support her weight. His face had gone pale, and his visits stopped entirely after that. "He needs time to adjust," his mother had explained when Svala's family inquired. "This is difficult for everyone." But Svala had seen the truth in his eyes during that final visit. He had fallen in love with a dancer, not a woman. When the dancing stopped, so did his affection. The seasons that followed tested every assumption Svala had held about her place in the world. Simple tasks that she had never thought about, drawing water from the well, climbing to the sleeping loft, even walking to the privy, became complex challenges requiring help or careful planning. Her independence, something she had valued without even realizing it, vanished overnight. Yet perhaps the cruelest blow was the way people's eyes changed when they looked at her. Where once they had held admiration and joy, now she saw pity mixed with discomfort. Conversations would halt when she appeared, only to resume in hushed tones after she passed. Children, who had once gathered around her, now watched from a distance, uncertain how to approach someone so fundamentally altered. Jarn the Mountain had always been different from the others, even before her illness. While most people lived clustered in the village proper, he maintained a homestead on the forest edge, close enough to answer calls for help, but far enough away to discourage casual visitors. Stories about him had grown like winter shadows. Some claimed he could speak to animals, others that he had once killed 12 men in a single battle. The truth, as usual, proved more complicated than legend. He stood apart even in a room full of people, not from arrogance, but from a kind of careful distance that suggested old wounds. His size alone would have made him remarkable. 7 feet of solid muscle earned through years of swinging battle axes and hauling timber. His hands could span a man's head, yet villagers who had watched him treat injured animals spoke of surprising gentleness. Svala had noticed him at village gatherings long before her illness, though she doubted he had paid her much attention. He would arrive alone, speak little, and leave early. When he did participate in conversations, his words carried weight that made people listen carefully. There was an intelligence behind his steady grey eyes that contrasted sharply with his reputation as a simple warrior. During her dancing days, she had occasionally caught him watching her performances, though his expression remained unreadable. Unlike others who showed obvious pleasure or excitement, Jarn observed with the focused attention of someone studying a complex problem. She had wondered in idle moments what thoughts moved behind that impassive face. Now, as she sat in her specially crafted chair beside the sacred oak, those same grey eyes held something she had never seen before, recognition that went deeper than pity or discomfort. When he had stepped through the crowd of wedding guests, when he had knelt before her and spoken those impossible words, she had felt something shift in the foundations of her understanding. "You are not less," he had said. "You are more, because you endure." The wedding guests still whispered among themselves, trying to make sense of what they had witnessed. Jarn the Mountain, who had never shown interest in any woman, had just proposed marriage to a disabled bride abandoned by her betrothed. Some called it madness. Others saw it as either supreme kindness or calculating opportunism. Svala touched the silver bells one more time, then closed the wooden box. Whatever his motivations, Jarn had offered her something she had thought lost forever, the possibility of a future that included respect rather than pity. Whether she possessed the courage to accept remained to be seen. Outside her window, the village continued its daily rhythms. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Children played in the dusty streets, and life moved forward with the steady persistence that characterized her people. But something fundamental had changed in the few moments it took for one man to cross a circle and speak a handful of words. Tomorrow would bring decisions that could reshape her entire existence. Tonight, She would sit with the silence where her bells once sang and consider whether dignity might sound different than she had imagined. The morning of her wedding dawned crisp and clear, with frost painting delicate patterns on the window panes of Svala's family home. Her mother had risen before dawn to begin preparations, heating water for bathing and laying out the ceremonial garments that had been worn by 3 generations of brides in their family line. The scent of herbs burning in the hearth, lavender for peace, rosemary for remembrance, filled the small dwelling with an almost sacred atmosphere. Despite her doubts, Svala felt a flutter of hope as her sister Ingrid helped her into the wedding dress. The garment had been carefully altered to accommodate her seated position, but the deep blue wool still fell in elegant folds, and the silver embroidery still caught the early light. Her mother fastened a cloak of white fur around her shoulders, then stepped back to survey her daughter with eyes that held both pride and worry. "You look like a queen," Astrid whispered, though her voice carried undertones of uncertainty. "Eriksson will remember why he fell in love with you when he sees you today." Svala nodded, though she noticed her mother's choice of words. Remember why, rather than simply see how beautiful she looked. Even Astrid, who loved her fiercely, seemed to question whether love could survive such fundamental change. The procession to the sacred oak began at midday, when the sun stood highest and strongest. Svala's carved wooden chair, a masterwork created by the village's finest craftsmen specifically for this day, was decorated with ribbons and early spring flowers. Her male cousins carried her with careful dignity, their faces solemn with the weight of tradition and circumstance. Behind them walked her family, friends, and nearly every villager who could leave their daily tasks. Wedding celebrations brought the entire community together, sharing in the joy of new unions and the promise of future generations. Children scattered flower petals along the path, while elderly women sang ancient blessing songs their grandmothers had taught them. The sacred oak stood in a natural clearing at the village's heart, its massive trunk requiring a dozen people holding hands to encircle completely. Countless couples had spoken their vows beneath its spreading branches, and local tradition held that marriages blessed by the ancient tree would endure as long as its roots drank from the earth. Spring buds dotted its branches like tiny promises, though the tree would not achieve full leaf for several more weeks. Svala's chair was positioned carefully at the base of the tree, facing the path where Eriksson would arrive with his own procession. The village elder, Magnus Ironbeard, took his position between bride and the space reserved for the groom, his ceremonial staff planted firmly in the soft earth. His weathered face carried the gravity appropriate for such moments, though his eyes held compassion when they rested on Svala. The waiting began. Custom dictated that the groom arrive precisely when the sun reached its zenith, marked by shadows falling directly beneath objects rather than stretching in any direction. Guests arranged themselves in a loose circle around the sacred space, their conversations gradually quieting as the appointed time approached. Svala folded her hands in her lap and tried to calm the nervous energy that made her stomach flutter. She reminded herself of Eriksson's genuine affection during their courtship, his promises that nothing fundamental would change between them. Perhaps her doubts were simply wedding nerves, the natural anxiety that accompanied such momentous decisions. The sun reached its peak. Shadows disappeared. The time for ceremony had arrived, but no procession appeared on the path leading from the merchant quarter where Eriksson lived with his family. Magnus cleared his throat diplomatically. "Sometimes the nervous groom needs a few extra moments to gather his courage," he announced to the assembled guests. Though his tone suggested this explanation satisfied no one, minutes stretched into quarter hours. Conversations resumed, though now they carried undertones of confusion and growing concern. Some guests glanced toward the path with increasing frequency, while others began to study Svala with expressions that mixed sympathy with embarrassment. Svala's mother approached the chair and knelt beside her daughter. "Perhaps there was some confusion about the timing," Astrid suggested quietly, though her eyes held doubt. "Shall I send one of your cousins to check on his preparations?" Before Svala could respond, a figure appeared on the path, but not the one they expected. Young Bjorn, Eriksson's nephew, ran toward the gathering with obvious urgency. His face flushed red from exertion, and his eyes refused to meet Svala's directly when he reached the edge of the circle. "Where is your uncle?" Magnus asked with the authority of his position. Bjorn shifted uncomfortably, his gaze fixed on the ground. He sends his regrets," the boy stammered. "He says he cannot. He is unable to proceed with the ceremony." The words fell into silence, so complete that even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Svala felt something cold settle in her chest, a numbness that spread outward until her fingertips tingled with it. "Cannot or will not." Magnus pressed, his voice carrying steel beneath the diplomatic phrasing. "He has left the village," Bjorn admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "He departed before dawn, with a trading caravan heading east. He left this." The boy extended his hand, revealing a small object that caught the light with cruel brightness. Eriksson's wedding ring, the gold band that should have been placed on Svala's finger during the ceremony, lay in Bjorn's palm, like an accusation. Gasps rippled through the gathered crowd. Some guests turned away, unable to witness such public humiliation. Others stared with the horrified fascination that accompanies witnessing tragedy unfold. A few began to whisper among themselves, their voices creating a buzzing undertone that felt like wasps circling wounded prey. Svala stared at the abandoned ring, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. Eriksson had not simply delayed the ceremony or requested postponement. He had fled, literally fled, rather than marry her. The gold band represented everything they had planned together, every promise he had made, every future they had discussed during long evening walks when the world had seemed full of possibility. "I see," she said finally, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. Inside, everything felt like it was crumbling. But years of performing had taught her to maintain composure, even when emotions threatened to overwhelm. Magnus looked uncertain about how to proceed. Wedding ceremonies occasionally faced delays or complications, but complete abandonment by the groom fell outside normal experience. Protocol existed for many contingencies, but not for this particular form of public rejection. The crowd's whispers grew louder, creating a sound like distant thunder. Svala caught fragments of conversation, speculation about her condition, questions about what would happen next. Expressions of pity mixed with barely concealed relief that such fate had not befallen the speaker's own daughters. "Perhaps we should," Magnus began, clearly struggling to find words that might preserve some dignity from this disaster. Then the crowd parted, footsteps approached, heavy, deliberate, unhurried. Conversations died as people turned to see who dared interrupt such a charged moment. Through the gap in the circle of guests walked Jarn the Mountain, his massive frame casting shadows even in the bright midday sun. He wore simple clothes, clean but clearly intended for work rather than ceremony. His dark hair hung loose around his shoulders, and his grey eyes focused entirely on Svala as he crossed the sacred space. There was nothing hasty about his movement, nothing that suggested impulse or sudden decision. He walked like a man who had considered his actions carefully and chosen his path with full understanding of its consequences. When he reached Svala's chair, he stopped. The silence stretched so complete that she could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. Then, with surprising grace for such a large man, he knelt on one knee before her chair, bringing his eyes level with hers. "You are not less," he said, his voice carrying clearly to every guest gathered around the sacred tree. "You are more because you endure." He extended one massive hand, palm upward, in invitation rather than demand. "Will you marry me instead?" The words hung in the air like something solid, reshaping the entire nature of the moment. This was not pity or charity or even kindness. It was a choice made by a man who saw value where others saw diminishment. Svala looked into those steady grey eyes and saw something that Eriksson's gaze had never held, recognition of who she truly was. Beneath the surface, changes that illness had wrought. For the first time since her fever broke, Someone was looking at her without measuring her against who she used to be. Around them, the village held its collective breath, waiting to see whether dignity could triumph over devastation, whether courage could answer courage, whether one man's unexpected proposal could transform a day of shame into something approaching redemption. The silence that followed Jarn's proposal stretched like a taut bowstring, pregnant with possibility and disbelief. Svala found herself staring into his grey eyes, searching for some hint of mockery or ulterior motive, but finding only patient sincerity. Around them, the wedding guests remained frozen in a tableau of shock, as if a single movement might shatter the strange magic of the moment. Magnus Ironbeard was the first to recover his voice. "This is highly irregular," he managed, his weathered hands gripping his ceremonial staff with white knuckles. "The banns have not been properly posted. The families have not negotiated terms. There are procedures. There are also precedents," Jarn replied, without taking his eyes from Svala's face. "The old laws speak of substitution in cases of abandonment. If the bride consents and a worthy man offers himself, the ceremony may proceed." Several guests murmured among themselves at this unexpected display of legal knowledge. Most viewed Jarn as a simple warrior, more comfortable with axes than ancient customs. His citation of specific marriage laws suggested depths that few had suspected. Svala's cousin Eric stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "And what makes you worthy?" he demanded, his young voice carrying the protective anger of family. "You appear from nowhere, make grand gestures, but what do we know of your intentions? What surety do we have that you won't abandon her as well?" Jarn rose slowly to his full height, his movement unhurried, but somehow conveying immense power held in careful check. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of stone mountains and ancient forests. "I have lived among you for 7 years, he said. "In that time, has any man called me oathbreaker? Has any woman claimed I treated her with dishonor? Have I taken what was not freely given, or failed to honor agreements made?" The challenge hung in the air. Several villagers exchanged glances, searching their memories for evidence of poor character or broken promises. Finding none, they remained silent. "Your reputation for violence is well known," Eric pressed, though with less conviction than before. "What assurance?" "Violence in service of protection," interrupted old Henrik, the village's senior hunter. "When wolves threatened the Anderson children 2 winters past, who tracked them for 3 days through killing cold? When raiders tested our defenses last summer, who stood watch alone for 7 nights to let the rest of us sleep safely?" Other voices joined in, reluctantly at first, then with growing confidence. Stories emerged of quiet acts of service, a roof repaired after storm damage, a lost cow tracked and returned, assistance given without payment or recognition. The picture that developed was of a man who kept himself apart, not from arrogance but from some deeper wound, yet who never failed to answer calls for help. Astrid approached her daughter's chair, kneeling beside it as she had earlier. "What does your heart tell you?" she whispered urgently. "This decision cannot be undone lightly." Svala looked at the abandoned gold ring still gleaming in young Bjorn's palm, then at the massive hand Jarn still held extended toward her. The contrast could not have been starker. One represented promises broken at the first test, the other offered itself with full knowledge of what acceptance would mean. "Why?" she asked quietly, her voice meant for Jarn alone, but carrying clearly in the hushed atmosphere. "Why would you choose this?" "Choose me?" For the first time, something like vulnerability flickered across his impassive features. "Because," he said slowly as if the words cost him effort, "I have seen what the world does to those it considers broken. I have been broken myself. Yet here you sit with dignity intact, bearing shame that belongs to another. That speaks to strength most warriors never achieve." He paused, seeming to gather himself before continuing. "And because I have watched you when you thought none were looking. Your spirit was never in your legs, Svala, Astrid's daughter. It was always in your heart." The words hit her like physical blows, not from cruelty, but from unexpected truth. In the seasons since her illness, everyone had focused on what she had lost. her dancing, her mobility, her original prospects for marriage. No one had spoken of what remained, or suggested that what endured might be more valuable than what had vanished. "This is madness," someone called from the crowd. Gunnar, the blacksmith, his voice thick with drink despite the early hour. "The mountain may be honorable, but he's also cursed." Everyone knows the stories. Women who get too close to him meet unfortunate ends. A ripple of unease passed through the gathered villagers. The stories Gunnar referenced were old gossip, tales of a woman who had supposedly died in Jarn's company years before. Details remained vague and contradictory, but whispers persisted that those who grew close to the giant warrior faced mysterious doom. Jarn's expression darkened at the accusation, his jaw tightening with suppressed emotion. For a moment, Svala glimpsed something raw and wounded beneath his controlled exterior. Grief, perhaps, or guilt that had long festered in silence. "Speak plainly." "Gunnar," Magnus commanded, his authority cutting through the alcohol-fueled boldness. "If you have accusations to make them clearly and with evidence. Otherwise, hold your tongue." Gunnar shifted uncomfortably but pressed on. "All I'm saying is there are questions about his past. Questions about what happened to that healer woman who used to visit his homestead. Questions about why he lives alone when most men his age have wives and children. Questions are not answers," Jarn replied, his voice controlled, but carrying an undercurrent that made several guests step backward involuntarily. "And the past belongs to those who lived it." Svala found herself studying his face with new intensity. The grief she had glimpsed suggested loss rather than guilt, sorrow rather than malice. Whatever secrets he carried, they seemed to weigh on him rather than empower him. "The ceremony proceeds, or it does not," Magnus announced, clearly eager to resolve the situation before it deteriorated further. "But we cannot stand here debating ancient gossip while the day ages around us. Svala Astrid's daughter, you have heard the offer made. What is your answer?" All eyes turned to her, and Svala felt the weight of decision settling across her shoulders like a heavy cloak. Before her lay two paths: accept Jarn's unexpected proposal and step into an unknown future with a man she barely knew, or decline and face the long, slow process of rebuilding a life around the ruins of this day. She thought of Eriksson's abandoned ring, of the fear in his eyes when he realized she would never dance again. Then she looked at Jarn's steady gaze, patient and unwavering, despite the hostile questions and barely contained accusations swirling around him. "I have a condition," she said finally, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "If I accept your proposal, I want to know the truth about these questions Gunnar raises. All of it. I will not enter marriage blind to the past that shapes my husband." Jarn nodded slowly. "That is fair," he agreed, "and wise. There are indeed things you should know before binding your fate to mine." "Then I accept," she said, placing her hand in his. The contact sent unexpected warmth up her arm. His hand was rough with calluses, but gentle in its grasp, large enough to completely envelop hers, yet holding it as carefully as he might cradle a bird with a broken wing around them. The crowd released a collective breath that seemed to have been held since the moment Eriksson's abandonment was announced. Whatever came next, this day would be remembered as the time Svala Astrid's daughter chose courage over comfort, mystery over the familiar disappointment of known quantities. The 3 days between Svala's acceptance and the hastily arranged ceremony passed in a whirlwind of consultation, preparation, and increasingly anxious deliberation. Her family's small dwelling became a constant gathering place for the village's women, each arriving with opinions, advice, and barely concealed curiosity about the unprecedented match. Astrid sat at her ancient weaving loom, her fingers working the familiar patterns, while her mind wrestled with maternal concern. The loom had belonged to her grandmother and her grandmother's grandmother before that. 4 generations of women had created the fabric of their lives upon its sturdy frame. Now its rhythmic clacking provided a comforting backdrop to conversations that ranged from practical to deeply troubling. "He has land and a strong homestead," offered Sigrid. the baker's wife, as she helped sort through Svala's possessions to determine what should accompany her to her new home. That matters more than romance when winter comes hard. Land means nothing if the man who holds it brings danger, countered Ragnhild, whose husband served as one of the village's watchmen. These stories about his past, what if there's truth behind them? What if Svala finds herself isolated with a man whose history holds dark secrets? Svala listened to the debate while carefully folding her clothes into wooden chests. Each garment carried memories: the blue dress she had worn to her first harvest festival, the warm cloak her father had given her before his death, the simple work dress that had been altered to accommodate her changed circumstances. The physical act of packing provided structure for thoughts that otherwise threatened to spiral into panic. "What do you know of his daily habits?" asked Thyra, the village's most senior matron, and a woman whose advice carried considerable weight. A man's character shows clearest in how he conducts himself when he believes none are watching. "Little enough," Astrid admitted, her hands never pausing in their weaving. "He keeps to himself, trades fairly when he comes to market, pays his obligations to the community without complaint. But beyond that, I've seen him at the healers," Ingrid offered quietly. She worked sometimes as assistant to Helga the Wise, the village's primary herbalist and midwife. "He brings injured animals, wild creatures that most would leave to die. Wounded deer, birds with broken wings, even a wolf pup once that had lost its pack." This revelation sparked immediate interest among the assembled women. Men who showed gentleness toward helpless creatures often possessed depths of character that remained hidden in daily interactions. "What manner of injuries?" Thyra pressed. "Natural mishaps or both," Ingrid replied. "Some clearly from predators or accidents. Others—" She hesitated, then continued with obvious reluctance. "Others looked like they might have come from traps or weapons." As if someone had been deliberately cruel, an uncomfortable silence followed this observation. In their harsh northern climate, most people viewed animals as resources rather than companions. Those who tortured creatures for amusement revealed character flaws that often extended to their treatment of people. "And he tends them personally?" Astrid asked. "Always. He has knowledge of herbs and healing that rivals Helga's own. His hands are amazingly gentle for their size. I've watched him set tiny bird bones with more care than most show their own children." Svala found this information both comforting and puzzling. The image of the massive warrior delicately tending wounded creatures seemed to contradict his fearsome reputation. Yet it aligned with the unexpected tenderness she had witnessed during his proposal. "That speaks well of him," Thyra declared. "A man's treatment of the helpless reveals his true nature more clearly than his behavior toward equals." "But what of the stories?" Ragnhild insisted. "What of this woman who supposedly died in his company?" "We cannot simply ignore. We know nothing," Astrid interrupted firmly. "Only rumors and whispers that grow more dramatic with each telling. Would you have my daughter base her future on gossip?" The debate continued through the afternoon, touching on practical concerns about the isolated homestead, speculation about Jarn's financial resources, and endless discussion of what married life might entail for a woman of Svala's altered circumstances. Through it all, the rhythmic sound of the loom provided constant counterpoint, the ancient rhythm of women's work, unchanged despite the extraordinary nature of current events. As evening approached and the other women departed to tend their own families, Svala found herself alone with her mother beside the familiar loom. Astrid continued weaving, but her pace had slowed, and Svala noticed subtle tension in her shoulders that spoke of deep worry. "What does your heart tell you?" Svala asked quietly, echoing her mother's question from the wedding ceremony. Astrid's hands stilled on the threads. "My heart tells me you are braver than I ever was at your age," she replied after a long pause. "When your father died, I could have remarried. Several good men expressed interest, but I chose safety over possibility, comfort over adventure. I sometimes wonder what might have been different if I had possessed your courage." "This doesn't feel like courage," Svala admitted. "It feels like desperation dressed in hopeful clothing." "Perhaps courage and desperation are not so different," Astrid suggested. Both require us to act despite uncertainty, to choose forward movement over paralysis. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the last light fade from the windows. The sounds of village evening surrounded them, children being called in for supper, livestock settling for the night, the distant murmur of conversations from other households. "There is something else," Astrid said eventually. "Something I have not mentioned to the others." Svala looked up from her packing, noting the serious tone in her mother's voice. "I have seen him watching you," Astrid continued. "Not recently, but for months before your illness. During festivals, at community gatherings, he would position himself where he could observe without being obvious about it. The watching was respectful, admiring but not intrusive. This revelation struck Svala like a physical blow. Before the fever? Before I was... She gestured helplessly at her useless legs. "Before any of that mattered to him," Astrid confirmed. "Whatever drew him to you, it was not pity for your current circumstances. That interest existed when you were still dancing, still whole, in the way the world measures such things." The implications of this information shifted Svala's entire understanding of recent events. Jarn's proposal had not been an impulsive act of charity or a calculated move to gain advantage. It represented the culmination of feelings that predated her transformation, suggesting that he saw value in her that transcended physical capabilities. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" she asked. "Because I wanted your decision to be based on present realities, not romantic speculation," Astrid replied. "But now that you have chosen, you deserve to know that his interest appears genuine and long-standing." Outside, full darkness had settled over the village. Tomorrow would bring the ceremony that would irrevocably alter the course of Svala's life. Tonight provided the last opportunity for doubt, for changing her mind, for choosing the familiar uncertainty of remaining in her mother's house over the unknown challenges of marriage to a man she barely understood. Instead, she felt something like peace settling over her shoulders. Whatever secrets Jarn carried, whatever dangers his past might hold, he had offered her dignity when others offered only pity. In a world that had suddenly become strange and threatening, that gift possessed value beyond calculation. The ancient loom sat silent now, its work suspended until morning. But its presence remained, solid, enduring, connecting past to future through the simple act of creating something useful from disparate threads. Perhaps marriage worked similarly, Svala thought. Perhaps two lives could be woven together into something stronger than either possessed alone. Regardless of what flaws or weaknesses they brought to the pattern, the wedding ceremony proceeded 3 days later beneath a sky streaked with morning clouds that seemed to mirror the uncertainty rippling through the gathered witnesses. Far fewer guests attended this second attempt, some from continued discomfort with the unusual circumstances, others from simple practicality, since most had already used their festival day for the previous failed ceremony. Those who did come brought a mixture of curiosity, genuine well-wishes, and barely concealed skepticism about the match. Svala wore the same blue dress, though her mother had added new silver threading around the collar, a small gesture toward making this ceremony distinct from the previous disaster. Jarn appeared in clothes that surprised everyone. Instead of his usual rough work garments, he wore a tunic of deep green wool that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders, and his wild hair had been trimmed and braided with leather cords. The transformation suggested that his usual appearance represented choice rather than carelessness. Magnus Ironbeard performed the ceremony with efficiency born of long practice, though he occasionally glanced toward the forest edge as if expecting some interruption or revelation. The vows they spoke followed ancient patterns, promises of loyalty, protection, and shared burden that had bound couples together for countless generations. When Jarn placed the ring on Svala's finger, a simple band of silver he had crafted himself, his hands trembled slightly, with an emotion she could not identify. "You may kiss your bride," Magnus announced. And for the first time, uncertainty flickered across Jarn's composed features. He leaned down carefully, his massive frame folding with surprising grace until his face was level with hers. The kiss was gentle, tentative, the touch of a man who had perhaps forgotten how to show affection or who feared his strength might cause harm. When they separated, Svala found herself studying his eyes and seeing something vulnerable there, quickly hidden but unmistakably present. The feast that followed was modest compared to the celebration originally planned for her marriage to Eriksson, but it carried genuine warmth. Jarn sat beside her at the high table, speaking little but listening intently to conversations around them. She noticed that he ate sparingly and that his attention frequently drifted to the forest edges, as if some part of him remained perpetually alert for potential threats. "You seem nervous," she observed quietly during a lull in the surrounding chatter. "Unused to crowds," he replied. His voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "Too many people, too much noise. It makes the skin crawl after years of solitude." The admission revealed another layer of his character, not antisocial behavior born of arrogance, but genuine discomfort with social situations that suggested old wounds or ingrained habits. She wondered what experiences had taught him to prefer isolation, what betrayals or disappointments had made human company feel dangerous. When the formal celebration concluded and the time came to travel to his homestead, Jarn lifted her into a specially prepared cart with cushions and supports designed to make the journey comfortable. Her possessions, pitifully few when gathered together, filled only 2 small chests, a stark reminder of how thoroughly her life had been reduced to essentials. The ride through the forest revealed why Jarn had chosen his location. His homestead sat in a natural clearing surrounded by ancient pines, protected from harsh winds but open enough to receive good sunlight. A clear stream ran along one edge of the property, and carefully tended gardens showed evidence of both practical crops and ornamental plants. The main dwelling was larger than she had expected, a substantial timber structure with good craftsmanship evident in every joint and beam. But it was the small details that truly surprised her. Wind chimes hung from the eaves, creating gentle music as evening breezes stirred them. Flower boxes beneath the windows held early spring blooms that served no practical purpose beyond beauty. A carved wooden bench faced the sunset, positioned for contemplation rather than work. "You made all this yourself?" she asked as he helped her from the cart. "Most of it," he confirmed. The house took 3 summers to complete. Everything else grew from there as need or desire suggested. Inside, the dwelling revealed even more unexpected elements. The main room featured a massive stone fireplace with intricate carvings around its opening. Scenes of forest animals and flowing water that spoke of artistic sensibility rarely associated with warriors. Shelves lined one wall, filled with books whose presence in a supposedly simple fighting man's home raised questions about his education and interests. "I did not expect a scholar's library," Svala admitted, running her fingers along the leather-bound spines. "Knowledge weighs nothing and takes little space," Jarn replied, though something in his tone suggested these books carried personal significance beyond their practical value. "And winter nights grow long when spent alone." He showed her through the rest of the dwelling with the careful attention of someone who wanted approval but feared judgment. A bedroom had been prepared for her with obvious thought, the bed positioned to provide views of both forest and stream, a small table within easy reach, hooks on the walls placed at heights she could access from her chair. "The door can be barred from inside," he mentioned casually, then paused as if regretting the words. "I mean, you need not fear intrusion. Your privacy will be respected unless you choose otherwise." The awkward declaration touched her unexpectedly. In their harsh society, wives were often considered property to be used as husbands saw fit. His promise of choice rather than expectation suggested either unusual consideration or perhaps his own discomfort with intimacy. That evening they shared a simple meal he prepared with competent efficiency, venison stew, flavored with herbs from his garden. bread that proved surprisingly well made, and tea brewed from plants she did not recognize. They ate in relative silence, both struggling with the strangeness of suddenly sharing space with someone who remained essentially a stranger. "Tell me about the animals Ingrid mentioned," Svala said eventually, seeking safer ground for conversation. "The injured creatures you bring to the healer." His expression shifted, becoming more animated than she had seen since his proposal. "They trust more easily than people," he said. "A wounded animal knows only that you offer help or harm. They do not judge your motives or question your past. And you prefer that simplicity?" "I understand it," he replied after considering the question. "Human motivations are complicated. Animals act from instinct, from immediate need. There is honesty in that which appeals to me." As darkness settled around the homestead, Jarn showed her to her room with formal politeness that somehow conveyed both respect and distance. Before leaving her, he paused in the doorway. "If you need anything during the night, anything at all, my room is just across the hall. Do not hesitate to call." Alone at last, Svala sat by her window and looked out at the star-scattered sky visible through the forest canopy. The ancient runestone Jarn had shown her during their tour stood just visible in the moonlight, a weathered monument covered with symbols whose meanings had been lost to time. Like her new husband, it held secrets that might never be fully understood. But unlike the cold stone, Jarn had shown flashes of warmth beneath his guarded exterior. His care in preparing her room, his gentle handling during the journey, his obvious love for this place he had created, all suggested depths that warranted exploration, regardless of what shadows his past might hold. The first weeks of marriage settled into rhythms that surprised Svala with their gentle predictability. Each morning, Jarn would rise before dawn to tend his animals and check the forest borders of his property. By the time she woke, he would have fresh water drawn from the stream, porridge warming over the fire, and tea steeping with herbs whose names he patiently taught her: willow bark for pain, chamomile for restful sleep, elderflower for the simple pleasure of its delicate flavor. Their conversations remained careful, polite, circling around deeper topics like cautious animals testing unfamiliar ground. But gradually, small revelations emerged through daily interactions. Jarn possessed an extensive knowledge of plant lore that rivaled the village healer's expertise. His garden contained not just common vegetables, but carefully cultivated medicinal herbs, some so rare that Svala had heard of them only in the oldest healing songs passed down through generations of wise women. "Where did you learn such things?" she asked one morning, as she watched him examine a patch of feverfew, determining which leaves were ready for harvest. "From someone who needed the knowledge," he replied, his standard deflection when questions touched on his past. But then, perhaps feeling the inadequacy of such evasion between married people, he added quietly, "I had reasons to become skilled in healing, reasons that made such knowledge necessary rather than merely useful." The leather pouch he carried on his belt held an assortment of dried herbs and prepared remedies, carefully organized and maintained. She had seen him consult it when treating injured animals, selecting specific combinations, with the precision of someone whose knowledge came from hard-won experience rather than casual study. It was during her second week at the homestead that she first witnessed the full extent of his unusual calling. She had been sitting by her window, enjoying the morning sun and working on embroidery that gave her hands purposeful occupation, when movement at the forest edge caught her attention. Jarn appeared between the trees, walking slowly and carrying something against his chest with obvious care. As he drew closer, she could see his burden, a young deer perhaps 6 months old, with one of its rear legs hanging at an unnatural angle. The animal lay still in his arms, not from death, but from the complete trust that prey species sometimes showed toward those who offered help rather than harm. "What happened?" she called from her window as he approached the small shelter he had built specifically for treating injured creatures. "Trapped in deadfall," he replied without looking up, his attention focused entirely on his patient. "Leg is broken but cleanly. Should heal well with proper setting. She wheeled her chair to where she could observe his work, fascinated despite her lack of experience with such things. His massive hands moved with delicate precision as he examined the injury, speaking softly to the deer in low tones that seemed to calm rather than frighten it. The animal's dark eyes remained alert but unafraid, as if it somehow understood that this giant meant no harm. The process of setting the bone required careful manipulation and the creation of a splint from carefully selected wood strips. Throughout the procedure, Jarn maintained a running commentary directed at the deer, explanations of what he was doing, reassurances about temporary discomfort, promises that healing would come with patience. "You talk to them," Svala observed. "They listen better than most people," he replied, securing the splint with soft leather strips. "And they judge less harshly. Is that why you prefer their company?" He paused in his work, his hands stilling as he considered the question. "Perhaps," he admitted. "Or perhaps I simply understand what it means to be wounded and afraid." The vulnerability in those words struck her more powerfully than any deliberate revelation might have. For the first time since accepting his proposal, she glimpsed the pain that lay beneath his careful composure. Old hurts that had driven him to seek solitude. Experiences that made the simple trust of injured animals precious beyond measure. "Will it heal completely?" she asked, changing the subject when she saw him retreat from the moment of openness. "Most likely. The young heal faster and more completely than their elders." He lifted the deer carefully, carrying it to a pen where it could rest safely while recovery progressed. "Though it may always favor that leg slightly. Some injuries leave their mark even after the bone knits whole." The metaphor was not lost on either of them. They had both learned how wounds could heal, yet leave permanent changes. How survival sometimes required accepting new limitations while discovering unexpected strengths. As the days passed, Svala found herself drawn increasingly into Jarn's work with the forest's injured creatures. Her chair proved useful for reaching supplies he needed while keeping both hands free for delicate procedures. Her steady hands, trained by years of precise needlework, adapted well to the careful work of cleaning wounds and preparing herbal poultices. More importantly, she discovered that her presence seemed to calm the animals almost as much as Jarn's did. Perhaps her seated position made her appear less threatening, or perhaps the gentleness forced upon her by circumstance communicated itself in ways that transcended species barriers. "You have a gift for this," Jarn observed after she successfully fed medicine to a hawk with a damaged wing, a bird so fierce that it had initially refused all attempts at treatment. "I understand what it means to depend on others for survival," she replied, stroking the hawk's feathers with careful fingers. "Sometimes that understanding matters more than strength or skill." Their work together created a bridge across the careful distance they had maintained since the wedding. Shared purpose provided safer ground for conversation than direct personal inquiry, yet the insights they gained into each other's character proved more valuable than formal questioning might have yielded. Jarn approached healing with scientific precision, combined with intuitive understanding of each creature's needs. He never forced treatment on animals that showed extreme fear, preferring to wait until trust developed naturally. His patience seemed infinite when dealing with their pain or resistance, yet he could make rapid decisions when emergency situations demanded immediate action. Svala found herself contributing organizational skills and emotional sensitivity that complemented his knowledge and physical capabilities. She created detailed records of treatments and outcomes, developed better systems for storing and accessing medicinal supplies, and often provided the emotional support that helped traumatized animals accept the help they needed. "We work well together," Jarn said one evening as they finished treating a fox whose paw had been damaged by a snare. It was a simple observation, delivered in his usual understated manner, but Svala heard deeper implications in the words. "Yes," she agreed, watching the fox settle into comfortable sleep in its recovery pen. "We do." Around them, the forest settled into its evening rhythms. Soon, small creatures would emerge from their hiding places to drink from the stream and forage for food. Some of them bore evidence of past encounters with Jarn's healing touch, a slight limp that spoke of bones properly mended, missing patches of fur that had grown back over healed wounds, scars that marked survival rather than defeat. Looking at her husband as he carefully cleaned and stored the tools of his unusual calling, Svala realized she was beginning to understand what had drawn him to this isolated life of service to the wounded and abandoned. In caring for creatures that others would dismiss as worthless, he had found purpose that validated his own worth, despite whatever darkness his past might hold. And perhaps, she thought as she wheeled her chair toward the house, she had found something similar. A new way of being useful that had nothing to do with dancing and everything to do with the strength that comes from choosing compassion over bitterness, hope over despair. The riders appeared at the forest edge on a morning when spring mist still clung to the lower branches, their silhouettes emerging from the grey dawn like figures from a nightmare half remembered. Svala saw them first from her window where she sat with her morning tea, and something in their purposeful approach sent ice through her veins, even before she could make out individual details. "Jarn!" she called, her voice carrying urgency that brought him immediately from the animal pens where he had been checking on their current patients. He moved to the window beside her chair, his body going rigid as he took in the scene. 5 men on horseback, armed and wearing the mixed armor and crude finery that marked them as raiders rather than honest travelers. Their leader rode slightly ahead of the others, a lean man with graying hair and scars that spoke of many battles survived through cunning rather than honor. "Bjorn Ironwolf," Jarn said quietly, and the name carried weight that made Svala's stomach clench with sudden fear. "You know them." "I know him." Jarn's voice had taken on a quality she had never heard before, cold, flat, emptied of the gentle warmth she had grown accustomed to. "Stay inside. No matter what you hear, do not come out until I return." He moved toward the door with quick efficiency, but Svala caught his arm as he passed her chair. "Wait, tell me what this means. Who is Bjorn Ironwolf to you?" For a moment, conflict played across his features, the desire to protect her from knowledge warring against the respect he had shown for her intelligence and strength. Finally, he knelt beside her chair, his grey eyes holding hers with desperate intensity. "He is my former captain," Jarn said, "and I am his former lieutenant. The raiding band I once led for him." The words hit her like physical blows. Every assumption she had made about his past, every romantic notion about the mysterious warrior who had rescued her from humiliation, crumbled in the space between one heartbeat and the next. "You were a raider," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "for 7 years, until I could no longer stomach what we became." His hands clenched into fists. "The woman who taught me about healing, the one the village whispers about, she was a healer we captured during a raid on a coastal settlement. I was ordered to..." He stopped, swallowing hard. "I was ordered to do things I could not do. When I refused, when I tried to protect her, Bjorn had her killed anyway." As a lesson about the price of defying orders, the revelation explained so much. His knowledge of herbs and healing learned from a captive woman, his gentle treatment of wounded creatures as if atoning for past cruelties, his preference for isolation over the company of people who might judge him for what he had been. "I left that night," he continued, "took nothing but my weapons and the knowledge she had shared with me. Bjorn swore he would find me someday, make me pay for the betrayal. It seems that day has arrived." Outside, the riders had reached the edge of his cleared land and sat their horses in a line, clearly visible and deliberately intimidating. Their leader called out in a voice that carried easily across the distance, "Jarn Eriksson, come out and face your old friends. We have much to discuss." Svala felt something cold and solid settle in her stomach. "What do they want?" "Me," Jarn replied simply. "They want me to return, to take my place as Bjorn's lieutenant again. And if I refuse..." He did not need to finish the thought. The threat hung in the morning air like smoke from a distant fire, visible, toxic, and impossible to ignore. "There is something else you must know," Jarn said, his voice growing even quieter. "The raid where I met Helga, the healer who died, it was on a village much like this one. Peaceful people who had done nothing but exist in the wrong place when hungry men needed supplies. The implications struck her like a series of hammer blows. He had not simply been a raider. He had been one of those who brought terror to innocent settlements, who took what they wanted through violence and fear. The gentle man who treated injured animals with infinite patience had once been part of the nightmare that mothers used to frighten disobedient children. How many? She asked, though part of her did not want to know. Too many. The answer came like a confession torn from deep places. I told myself we were warriors, that this was how the world worked, that the strong had the right to take from the weak. It took watching Helga die for my refusal to participate in her rape to understand what I had really become. Outside, Bjorn called again, his voice carrying mockery and threat in equal measure. "Do not make us come to you, old friend. You know how that tends to end." Jarn rose from beside her chair, his movements carrying the fluid readiness of a man preparing for violence. The transformation was as startling as it was complete. The gentle healer she had married disappeared, replaced by someone harder, more dangerous, fundamentally alien to everything she thought she knew about him. "I have to go out there," he said. "If I do not, they will come in. And you, and I what?" she demanded, anger beginning to burn through the shock and fear. "I am not helpless, Jarn. Do not treat me as if I were." "You are not helpless," he agreed. "But you are untrained in violence, and they are experts in it. If they take you, they will use you to ensure my cooperation. I cannot allow that." He moved toward the door again, but this time she did not try to stop him. Instead, she called after him with a question that had to be asked despite the terrible timing. "The marriage," she said, "was it part of some plan? Some way to establish yourself in the village before they came?" He turned back, his face showing pain that seemed to cut deeper than any physical wound. "No," he said simply. "That was the one clean thing I have done in years. The one choice made from love, rather than duty or necessity or fear." Then he was gone, leaving her alone with the wreckage of everything she had believed about the man she had married. Through the window, she watched him walk across the clearing toward the waiting raiders, his shoulders straight and his pace unhurried despite the magnitude of what awaited him. Bjorn Ironwolf dismounted as Jarn approached, a thin smile playing across his scarred features. Even at this distance, Svala could see the predatory satisfaction in his posture, the look of a hunter who had finally cornered his prey after a long and patient pursuit. The two men met in the center of the clearing, close enough that she could see them speaking, but too far away for her to hear the words. Their conversation appeared civil enough from her vantage point, but she noticed how the other raiders positioned themselves to cut off any retreat, how their hands rested casually near their weapons. Then Bjorn handed Jarn something, a piece of parchment that even from a distance looked official, important. As Jarn read whatever message it contained, his posture changed subtly, his shoulders sagging as if under a tremendous weight. When he looked up from the parchment, his face had gone pale. He spoke briefly to Bjorn, who nodded once and remounted his horse. Then, to Svala's surprise, the raiders turned and rode back toward the forest, leaving Jarn standing alone in the clearing, with the paper still clutched in his hands. He remained motionless for long moments, staring at the document as if it contained words that could rewrite reality itself. When he finally turned and walked back toward the house, his movements carried the defeated shuffle of a man who had just learned that his past had finally caught up with him in ways he had never imagined. The door opened, and he entered, his face gray with shock and what looked like despair. Without speaking, he handed her the blood-stained letter, for she could see now that the dark spots on the parchment were indeed dried blood, brown and ominous against the pale surface. She read the message twice before its full implications settled into her understanding, like stones sinking into deep water. The village, their village, was under threat from a much larger raiding force. Bjorn's small band was merely the advance scouts for an army that would arrive within days. seeking not just plunder, but permanent control of the territory. And the only thing that might save the innocent people she had grown up among was for Jarn to resume his former position as Bjorn's lieutenant, to lend his tactical genius and fearsome reputation to an enterprise that would transform him back into everything he had spent 7 years trying to escape. "They know," he said quietly, his voice hollow with defeat. "They know about us, about the village, about everything. If I refuse to rejoin them, they will burn it all. Every house, every family, everyone you have ever known will die because I was too selfish to remain in exile where I belonged." The silence that followed Jarn's revelation stretched between them like a chasm that might never be bridged. Svala sat with the blood-stained letter in her lap, its terrible contents burned into her memory, while her husband stood by the window with his back to her, shoulders rigid with self-recrimination and barely contained despair. "Tell me about the village's defenses," she said finally. Her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. He turned, surprise flickering across his features. "Svala, tell me," she repeated firmly. "If we are to face this threat, I need to understand what we have to work with." For a moment he seemed to struggle with the concept that she might choose strategy over condemnation, planning over panic. Then, as if her practical response had given him permission to hope, he moved to the table and began to speak with the clinical precision of someone who had spent years analyzing such problems. "The village has perhaps 30 men of fighting age," he began. "Most are farmers and craftsmen with basic weapon skills, but no real combat experience. The walls are adequate against wild animals and casual raiders, but they would not withstand a determined assault by experienced warriors." He traced patterns on the table's surface as he spoke, his fingers mapping out tactical considerations with unconscious expertise. "The raiders coming number at least 200, possibly more. They will have siege equipment, detailed knowledge of the terrain, and the advantage of surprise if they attack before warnings can be spread. And if you rejoin them." His jaw tightened. "If I resume my position as Bjorn's lieutenant, the village will be spared immediate destruction, but only to serve as a base of operations for further raids throughout the region. The people would become subjects rather than free villagers, taxed and controlled by those who view them as resources to be exploited." Svala processed this information while studying her husband's face. The tactical knowledge he displayed was clearly hard-won through years of experience, but the disgust with which he spoke of raider methods was equally genuine. Whatever he had been in the past, the man before her now found the prospect of returning to that life genuinely abhorrent. "There is a third option," she said quietly. "Which is, we warn the village and help them prepare for siege. Use your knowledge of raider tactics to create defenses they would not expect." Jarn shook his head immediately. "Impossible. Even with warning, even with perfect preparation, they cannot withstand a force of that size. It would be massacre disguised as heroism, not if we had help. From where? The nearest Allied settlements are days away, and we have no guarantee they would risk their own safety for our sake." Svala reached for the leather satchel that had become her constant companion since beginning work with the injured animals. From it, she withdrew a carved wooden staff, simple in appearance but carefully balanced and weighted, created by Jarn's own hands to serve as both walking aid and, if necessary, weapon from the people who know this land better than any raider army, she said, gripping the staff with both hands. "From those who have been watching and waiting for someone to give them reason to fight," understanding dawned in his eyes. "The exiled clans, the groups driven from their homes by previous raider attacks, scattered but not destroyed," she confirmed, "hungry for vengeance but lacking leadership and coordination." What if they had both? The idea took shape between them, like something solid and dangerous. Throughout the northern reaches, small bands of survivors maintained precarious existence in hidden camps and remote valleys, families and clans displaced by various raider groups over the years, too proud to submit but too few to effectively resist. It would require convincing them to trust someone who was part of the force that destroyed their homes. Jarn pointed out. It would require convincing them to trust someone who knows how raiders think, how they plan, how they can be defeated. Svala tested the weight of her staff, feeling strength flow through her arms and into her core. Someone who has knowledge they need and reason to use it against his former comrades. And if they refuse, if they decide that justice demands my death rather than my assistance, then we face the raiders alone and likely die in the attempt. She met his gaze steadily. But we face them as people who chose to fight rather than submit, who tried to save others rather than save ourselves. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats, a single rider this time, moving with urgent haste rather than the measured intimidation of the morning's visit. Through the window, they could see one of the village's young men, Olaf the miller's son, driving his horse hard toward their homestead. Jarn opened the door before the young man could dismount, his face grim with anticipation of bad news. "Raiders," Olaf gasped, his horse lathered with sweat and his own face flushed with exertion. 3 separate bands moving through the outer settlements. They are not taking anything, just passing through but leaving messages. Demands for tribute, warnings about resistance, promises of protection for those who submit willingly. How long? Jarn asked. The council estimates 3 days, maybe 4 before the main force arrives. They are giving people time to consider their options, to prepare either tribute or surrender. Svala felt something cold and determined settle in her stomach. Psychological warfare, she said. Let fear do the work before the fighting begins. Both men looked at her with surprise, and she realized she had spoken with an authority that neither expected from a village woman whose greatest challenge had previously been managing a household. "It is what I would do," she continued, her mind working through the implications with startling clarity. Give the defenders time to imagine all the terrible things that could happen. Let them argue among themselves about the best response. Allow doubt and despair to weaken their resolve before the first sword is drawn. Jarn studied her with new attention, as if seeing capabilities he had never suspected. "You understand strategy. I understand people," she corrected. "And people under pressure behave in predictable ways. Fear makes some fight harder, but it makes others look for any excuse to surrender." Olaf shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "The council wants to speak with you, Jarn. They have heard rumors about your past, about your knowledge of such things. Magnus Ironbeard requests your immediate presence." The moment of decision had arrived sooner than expected. Jarn looked at Svala, his expression holding questions that could not be spoken aloud in present company. "Go," she said simply. "Tell them what they need to hear. And tell them," she paused, considering her words carefully. What she said next would commit them both to a course of action that could end in death or worse. But the alternative, watching her husband return to a life that would destroy his soul, was unacceptable. Tell them that Svala Astridsdottir will not cower in her home while others decide her fate. Tell them that if they choose to fight, they will have whatever assistance a woman with a walking staff and a head for strategy can provide. Olaf's eyes widened at this unexpected declaration. But Jarn nodded slowly, understanding passing between them that transcended words. "And the exiled clans?" he asked quietly. "Send messengers," she replied. "Tell them that Jarn the Mountain calls for a gathering at the Old Stone Circle, 2 leagues north of the village. Tell them he brings knowledge of raider weaknesses and a plan for victory that does not require them to die as heroes. Will they come? Some will, and some is enough to begin with." As Jarn prepared to ride with Olaf back to the village, Svala made her own preparations. The simple life they had built together, the quiet healing work, the growing trust and affection, the hope for a future unmarked by violence, was ending, whether they chose it or not. But perhaps something stronger could be built from the ruins, something that honored both the man Jarn had become and the warrior he had once been. She tested her grip on the walking staff again, feeling the solid weight of ash wood beneath her palms. The weapon, for that was what it would become if her plan succeeded, represented more than mobility. It symbolized the choice to stand when standing seemed impossible, to fight when fighting appeared hopeless, to trust in the possibility that redemption could be earned through right action rather than endless self-recrimination. Outside, the forest was already beginning to stir with unusual activity. Birds called warnings to each other, small animals moved through the underbrush with nervous energy, and even the wind seemed to carry undertones of approaching storm. Change was coming, whether they welcomed it or not. The only question was whether they would meet it as victims or as people who had chosen their own fate. Whatever the cost might prove to be, dawn broke grey and cold on the morning of battle, with mist rising from the valley floor like the breath of sleeping giants. From her position on the ridge overlooking the village, Svala could see the raider army spread across the meadows below, a dark stain against the green earth, bristling with weapons and siege engines that spoke of careful planning and ruthless efficiency. The signal fire beacon they had constructed on the mountain peak stood ready, its dry wood and oil-soaked kindling waiting for the torch that would call their scattered allies to action. Beside it, Jarn checked his weapons one final time, his movements carrying the fluid precision of someone who had performed these rituals countless times before. 237, he said quietly, lowering the brass spyglass he had used to count the enemy force. More than we estimated, but not impossibly more. Svala nodded, though her attention was focused on the village below rather than the raiders surrounding it. Smoke rose from morning cooking fires, and she could see people moving through the streets with the careful deliberation of those who knew this might be their last ordinary day. Children had been gathered into the central buildings, while every adult capable of holding a weapon had taken positions along the walls and at strategic points throughout the settlement. "The archers are in position?" she asked, though she knew the answer. They had spent 3 days preparing for this moment, coordinating every detail with the methodical thoroughness that their desperate situation demanded. Hidden in the grain lofts and bell tower, as planned, Jarn confirmed. 32 bows, though most of the shooters have more enthusiasm than skill. Enthusiasm may prove more valuable than skill, Svala replied, testing the signal horn that hung at her side. Fear makes experienced warriors cautious, but it makes desperate defenders fierce. Below them, the raider army was beginning to stir as their leaders emerged from command tents and began the process of organizing for assault. Even at this distance, she could make out Bjorn Ironwolf's distinctive figure near the center of the formation, his grey hair catching the early light as he gestured toward the village walls. "He will offer terms first," Jarn said, following her gaze. "It is his way, one final chance for surrender before the killing begins. He considers it a mark of civilization, and when the village refuses, then he will demonstrate why refusal is unwise." Jarn's voice carried the flat certainty of someone who had witnessed such demonstrations before. "He will order the execution of prisoners taken from the outer settlements, publicly, where the defenders can see what awaits them if they continue to resist." The cold practicality of it made Svala's stomach clench, but she forced herself to think tactically rather than emotionally. "That is when we light the signal fire?" "When the executions begin," he agreed. "The sight of their allies dying will either break the defenders' will completely, or it will fill them with rage that burns away fear. Either way, it will be the moment when words cease to matter and only action remains." A distant trumpet sounded from the raider camp, its brass voice carrying clearly across the valley. Almost immediately, a delegation rode toward the village gates, Bjorn himself accompanied by 2 guards and a man carrying a banner of truce. "Begin the count," Svala said, settling herself more firmly in her concealed position. They had calculated that negotiations would last approximately 30 minutes, followed by a brief period for the village's response, then the beginning of hostilities. Timing would be crucial for their plan to succeed. Jarn lit a small hourglass they had brought for precisely this purpose, its sand beginning to trickle through the narrow waist with steady precision. "Marked," he said simply. Through the spyglass, they watched Bjorn's delegation halt before the village gates. The raider leader sat his horse with casual arrogance, calling out demands that were too distant to hear clearly, but whose general nature could be easily imagined: tribute, submission, acknowledgement of his authority over the territory and its people. Magnus Ironbeard appeared on the wall above the gates, his ceremonial staff visible even at their distance. The village elder's response was brief and decisive, his words carrying the weight of decision made through proper counsel and collective will. Even without hearing the exchange, its outcome was clear from Bjorn's reaction. The raider leader's posture shifted from confident negotiation to cold anger, his movements becoming sharp and aggressive as he realized that diplomacy had failed to achieve his objectives. 15 minutes, Jarn observed, checking the hourglass. Faster than expected. He is eager for violence, Svala replied. Perhaps too eager. Anger makes even experienced commanders make mistakes. The delegation turned and rode back toward the raider camp, leaving the village gates closed and defiant. Around the walls, she could see defenders taking final positions, checking weapons and saying what might be their last words to comrades and loved ones. "Light the beacon," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. Jarn struck flint to steel, coaxing flame from tinder with the same patient skill he applied to healing injured animals. The fire caught quickly, spreading through the carefully arranged kindling until it reached the oil-soaked logs at the beacon's heart. Flames leaped skyward, creating a pillar of smoke and light that could be seen for leagues in every direction. Somewhere in the hidden valleys and remote camps scattered throughout the northern reaches, exiled warriors would see that signal and know that the time for revenge had finally come. Whether enough would answer the call to make any difference remained to be seen. But the die was cast. "Now we wait," Jarn said, settling beside her with his bow ready and a quiver of arrows within easy reach. "Not long," Svala replied, raising the spyglass to study the raider camp. Look, below them, the enemy force was already moving into assault formation. Bjorn had wasted no time on elaborate preparations. The village's refusal had triggered immediate action designed to crush resistance before it could organize effectively. The first wave consisted of ladder-bearers and shield carriers, men whose job was to reach the walls and create openings for the heavier troops that would follow. Behind them came archers and crossbowmen, preparing to provide covering fire that would keep the defenders' heads down during the initial assault. "Here they come," Jarn murmured, his voice carrying the calm of someone who had faced such moments before and found peace with whatever outcome awaited. Svala gripped her walking staff more tightly, feeling strength flow through the seasoned wood into her arms and shoulders. Whatever happened in the next few hours, she would meet it as a participant rather than a victim, a woman who had chosen her fate rather than accepted what others decided for her. The battle for their village and their future was about to begin. The first arrows whistled through the morning air like deadly birds, their iron points finding gaps in wooden shields and piercing the earth around the village walls. From her elevated position, Svala watched the assault unfold with tactical clarity that surprised her, seeing patterns in the chaos, understanding the flow of attack and defense as if she had studied warfare for years rather than days. "The eastern wall," she said urgently, pointing with her staff toward a section where raider ladders were clustering. "They are concentrating their assault there. Magnus needs to shift archers from the gatehouse," Jarn nodded, raising a curved horn to his lips and sounding a series of calls that had been arranged beforehand, simple signals that could cut through battle noise and convey essential information. The horn's voice carried clearly across the valley, and she saw defenders begin to move in response, repositioning themselves according to the intelligence from their elevated observers. Below them, the raiders pressed forward with professional efficiency that spoke of many such assaults. Shield-bearers advanced in tight formation, their overlapping defenses creating a moving wall that absorbed the arrows raining down from the village walls. Behind them came ladder carriers, their wooden assault equipment reinforced with iron and designed to resist the crude defensive measures available to village militias. "There," Jarn said suddenly, his voice tight with recognition. "Bjorn is moving to the western approach, the one we expected him to use for his personal assault." Svala followed his gaze and saw the raider leader himself leading a select group of heavily armed warriors toward what appeared to be the village's strongest defensive position. It was a classic feint, attack where the enemy expects strength while the real assault develops elsewhere. "The signal," she said. "Now." Jarn lit a torch from their beacon fire and hurled it into a pile of green wood and damp leaves they had prepared for this moment. Thick white smoke billowed skyward, visible against the darker smoke of the main beacon, the agreed-upon sign that the battle had reached its critical phase. "Will they come?" Svala asked, though she knew neither of them could answer that question. "Some will," Jarn replied, fitting an arrow to his bowstring. "The question is whether some will be enough." The assault on the eastern wall reached its climax as the first raider ladders struck the wooden palisade. Defenders appeared above them, pushing the ladders away with long poles and dropping stones on the men trying to climb. But for every ladder pushed back, two more took its place, and gradually the attackers began to gain purchase on the wall's rim. Svala watched a young village defender, barely old enough to be called a man, swing his axe with desperate courage against a raider who had reached the top of his ladder. The blow went wide, and the raider's sword found its mark with fatal precision. The boy fell backward into the village streets, his blood staining the earth where children had played just hours before. "I have to help them," she said. Starting to rise from their concealed position, Jarn caught her arm gently but firmly. "Your help will come, but not in the way you think. Look." He pointed toward the northern ridge, where movement among the trees suggested large numbers of people making their way through the forest. As she watched, figures began to emerge from the tree line, dozens of them, then scores, moving with the coordinated purpose of warriors rather than the random scatter of refugees. "The exiled clans," she breathed. "Some of them," Jarn confirmed. "More than I hoped, fewer than I prayed for." The approaching reinforcements carried a variety of weapons and wore mixed armor that spoke of their scattered origins. But they moved with the deadly efficiency of people who had survived by their fighting skills. At their head rode a woman Svala recognized, Ingrid the Wolf Slayer, whose clan had been destroyed by raiders 3 seasons ago and who had since become a legend among the displaced. "She came," Jarn said, with something like wonder in his voice. "Despite everything I was, despite what I did to her people, she answered the call." Below them, the raiders had not yet noticed the approaching reinforcements. Their attention remained focused on the village walls, where the assault was reaching its critical moment. Several sections of the palisade now swarmed with climbing figures, and the sounds of hand-to-hand combat echoed across the valley. Then Ingrid's horn sounded from the northern ridge, a deep, resonant call that froze every raider in place as they recognized the sound of approaching doom. The exiled clans swept down from the heights like an avalanche, their war cries piercing the morning air as they fell upon the raiders' exposed flanks. "Now," Svala said, gripping her staff and pushing herself upright. "Now we join them." Jarn looked at her with alarm. "You cannot. The terrain is too rough, too dangerous." "I cannot climb down the ridge," she agreed. "But I can do something else." She reached into her pack and withdrew a raider banner, one of several they had captured during scouting missions in the days before the battle. With quick, efficient movements, she tore the fabric into strips and began tying them to arrows from Jarn's quiver. "Signal arrows," she explained. "Fire them toward different sections of the raider formation. Make them think they are surrounded by larger forces than they actually face." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "Confusion and misdirection. Fear," she corrected. "Make them afraid. Make them doubt their intelligence. Make them see enemies in every shadow. Fear will do more damage than 100 swords." As the exiled clans crashed into the raider formations below, Jarn began launching the signal arrows with careful precision. Each flaming projectile landed in a different area, creating the impression of coordinated attacks from multiple directions. The effect was immediate. Raider formations began to shift and fragment as commanders tried to respond to threats that existed only in their imagination. The tide of battle was turning, but the outcome remained far from certain. Bjorn Ironwolf still commanded a significant force, and his personal assault on the western wall was beginning to show results. Through the chaos and smoke, Svala could see the raider leader's distinctive figure moving with deadly purpose. Cutting down defenders with the skill that had made him legendary among his kind. "He has to be stopped," she said, watching Bjorn rally his troops for a final push toward the village heart. "I know," Jarn replied, setting aside his bow and reaching for his battle axe. "And I know who has to stop him." The torn raider banner fluttered in the wind beside them, a symbol of broken power and failed conquest, of the moment when predators learned that their prey could bite back with unexpected ferocity. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since the raiders appeared, victory seemed possible rather than merely hoped for. The final confrontation between Jarn and Bjorn Ironwolf took place in the village square, where the sacred oak had witnessed so many beginnings and now stood witness to an ending. The raider leader had fought his way through the defensive lines with the desperate fury of a man who understood that defeat meant more than military failure. It meant the destruction of everything he had built. Through years of careful brutality, Svala reached the square just as the two warriors circled each other like wolves testing for weakness, their weapons gleaming in the smoke-filtered sunlight. She had made her way down from the ridge with help from village defenders, her walking staff serving as both support and weapon as she navigated the debris-strewn streets. "You always were too soft for this life," Bjorn snarled, his sword weaving patterns in the air between them. "I should have killed you when you first showed weakness." "Perhaps," Jarn replied, his massive axe held in a guard position that spoke of decades of combat experience. "But you did not. And now softness has grown into something stronger than your cruelty ever was." Around them, the sounds of battle were diminishing as the combined forces of villagers and exiled clans systematically dismantled what remained of the raider army. Ingrid the Wolfslayer had proven as deadly as her reputation suggested, her warriors fighting with the focused intensity of people settling old debts. The tide had turned completely, but this personal duel would determine whether victory came with or without the satisfaction of justice. "Look around you," Jarn continued, gesturing with his free hand toward the destruction surrounding them. "What has your strength accomplished? What legacy will you leave beyond fear and ashes?" Bjorn's response was a savage attack that drove Jarn backward toward the oak's massive trunk. The raider leader fought with the skill of someone who had survived countless battles, his blade seeking gaps in his opponent's defense with snake-like speed. But Jarn had learned patience in his years of exile, and he gave ground strategically rather than meeting aggression with equal violence. Svala watched from her position near the square's edge, her heart hammering with fear and desperate hope. She understood that this contest was about more than personal survival. It represented the final test of whether Jarn could truly escape his past, or whether Bjorn's philosophy of might, making right, would reclaim him one final time. The turning point came when Bjorn, pressing his advantage too eagerly, overextended a thrust that should have ended the fight. Jarn sidestepped with surprising grace for such a large man, his axe sweeping in a horizontal arc that caught his former commander across the ribs with bone-crushing force. Bjorn staggered, his sword falling from nerveless fingers as he clutched at the mortal wound. Blood flowed between his fingers, staining the earth where countless wedding ceremonies had blessed new beginnings. "You could have been great," he gasped, falling to his knees beneath the sacred oak. "We could have ruled these lands together, taken whatever we wanted, answered to no one." "I was never meant for greatness," Jarn replied, lowering his axe as the fight left his opponent. "I was meant for this, protecting what matters, building rather than destroying." Bjorn died as he had lived, with curses on his lips and hatred in his eyes. But his death marked more than the end of one man's ambitions. It represented the final severing of chains that had bound Jarn to a past he could never fully escape, but had finally learned to transcend. In the days that followed, the village began the long process of rebuilding and healing. The exiled clans, their thirst for vengeance finally satisfied, chose to remain and help establish something better than what they had lost. Ingrid the Wolf Slayer proved as skilled at organizing communities as she was at destroying enemies. Her natural leadership providing structure for the scattered survivors who had answered their desperate call. Svala found herself at the center of these efforts, her strategic mind and organizational skills making her an invaluable coordinator for the reconstruction work. Her disability, which had once seemed like an insurmountable limitation, proved irrelevant in situations that required intelligence and determination rather than physical mobility. "You were right," Jarn told her one evening as they sat together in their restored homestead, watching the sun set over lands finally at peace. "About finding new ways to be useful, about strength taking different forms than people expect." She smiled, her hand resting on the simple wooden crown he had woven for her from early summer flowers, a replacement for the elaborate ceremony that had been interrupted by war, a symbol of love chosen freely rather than accepted from desperation. "We both found new ways," she replied. "You discovered that a warrior's greatest victory might be choosing not to fight. I learned that a dancer's grace can express itself through more than movement." Their healing practice had expanded beyond injured animals to include the human casualties of war, both physical wounds and the deeper injuries that violence inflicted on souls. Together, they had created something neither could have achieved alone, a center of compassion in a world that too often rewarded only strength. The village prospered under its new arrangements, with former exiles bringing skills and knowledge that complemented the agricultural expertise of the original inhabitants. Trade relationships developed with distant communities, based on mutual benefit rather than the extraction that raiders had imposed through fear. Children played again in the streets where blood had flowed, their laughter rising toward the sacred oak that had sheltered so many ceremonies of beginning, ending, and transformation. Some of these children would grow up never knowing the terror that had once stalked their lands, protected by the choices made by those who had learned that true strength lay not in taking what was wanted, but in defending what was loved. As autumn approached and the first harvest under the new arrangements promised abundance for all, Svala sat beneath the oak where her life had changed so dramatically. The silver bells from her dancing days rested in her lap, not as symbols of loss, but as reminders that every ending contained the seeds of new beginnings. Jarn found her there as evening settled over the village, his presence as comforting as it had become familiar. Together, they watched the lights of their community flicker to life in windows and doorways, each flame representing lives that had been saved, futures that had been preserved, hope that had been earned through courage and sacrifice. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Accepting my proposal? Leaving the life you knew for something so uncertain?" She considered the question seriously, as she did all important things. Then she smiled, her fingers tracing the engravings on her silver bells, patterns that would always carry music, even when they remained silent. "I regret nothing," she said. "You offered me dignity when others offered pity. You saw strength where others saw limitation. And together we built something worth protecting." The sacred oak rustled its leaves in the evening breeze, its ancient branches reaching toward stars that had witnessed countless stories of love, loss, and redemption. Beneath its shelter, two people who had found each other in the ruins of their separate disasters sat in comfortable silence, surrounded by the sounds of a community at peace. Their tale would be told for generations, not as a story of perfect heroes, but as testimony to the truth that love could grow from the most unlikely soil, that strength could emerge from brokenness, and that sometimes the most profound victories came not from conquering others, but from learning to see worth in what the world had dismissed as worthless.